The Cardassians are inarguably some of the most effective and interesting antagonists from the TNG era of Star Trek. Introduced in the later seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, they went on to become the main villains of Star Trek Deep Space Nine's entire run, providing the audience with some of that show's most compelling recurring characters, most notably Gul Dukat, Garrick, and Damar, all of whom I've made videos about in the past. Part of what makes the Cardassians such dependable baddies, or such irresistible anti-heroes in the case of Garrick and late-stage Damar, is that they are loaded with metaphor. The Cardassians are definitely on the show to stand in for, well, for something. That's what I wanted to talk about. See, folks like me have been saying for years that the Cardassians represent a very specific group of people in our history, and also, upsettingly, our present. But is it really that simple? To put the question as directly as possible, are Star Trek Deep Space Nine's Cardassians actually space Nazis? Because the Cardassians are such a regular presence on Deep Space Nine, as well as popping up several times in the last few seasons of TNG, we know more about the workings of their civilization than most other Star Trek aliens. They aren't quite as fleshed out as the Klingons or the Vulcans, but we see as much as we need to imagine what life might be like under the Cardassian regime. Besides, I sometimes wish we didn't know as much about the Klingons and the Vulcans as we do. And no, I'm not alluding to the fact that Klingons have two dicks. I'm so happy that we know that. You have no idea. Anyway, the Cardassians. We don't know any specifics about their genitalia, at least not canonically. I'm sure the topic has been dealt with to an exhausting and upsetting degree of detail in fanfiction, but we've seen enough to infer a few things about the nature of the Cardassian state. And I don't want to come to any conclusions yet, but I mean, it seems a little Nazi-ish. We learn about the Cardassian occupation of Bajor in their second ever appearance in the TNG episode Ensign. The occupation is an essential element of the Cardassians' presence in Star Trek and central to the question of whether or not they represent the Nazis, and I'll examine it in a bit more detail soon, but first, let's look at what we know about Cardassia itself. In the third appearance of Cardassians in TNG's classic two-parter Chain of Command, we start to get an idea of what life in the Cardassian Empire, or the Cardassian Union as the government is officially called, is like. While he's being held captive and tortured by Gul Madred, Captain Picard has a little informal debate with Madred about Cardassian history. Apparently, Cardassia was once a much more peaceful and open-minded society, but it fell into a severe economic depression that only ended when the military took control of the government. Yes, the wars Cardassia has waged, including a recent one against the Federation, were costly both in terms of lives and treasure, but they also enabled Cardassia to acquire territory and develop new resources. Because of the military and the programs initiated under its authority, my daughter will never have to go hungry, Madred tells Picard. Her belly may be full, Picard says, but her spirit will be empty. And then Madred cracks Picard one in the mouth. I bet it was worth it, though. Jean-Luc really zinged him. An authoritarian government rising to power following an economic collapse, that broadly matches how the Nazis came to power in Germany. But it's also reminiscent of the Russian Revolution of 1917, which led to the creation of the Soviet Union. And I could probably name a couple of other examples if I knew more about history, but I don't. I wasted my life watching Star Trek. When he's bragging about how awesome things are in Cardassia since the military took over, Gul Madred leaves a few things out. He mentions how things were going before, and okay, admittedly, they do sound like they were not great. Madred tells Picard that prior to the military taking over, there was mass starvation, bodies went unburied, and disease was rampant. That sounds practically Floridian. I'm sure life in Cardassia during that period was awful. Or would have been if we weren't talking about imaginary people. But to Captain Picard's point, the point he made that got him wrapped in the teeth, life under the Cardassian military dictatorship ain't so great either. Once Star Trek Deep Space Nine premieres and the Cardassians start showing up on a frequently recurring basis, we learn a lot more about what their society is like. Here are some fun features of Cardassian life in the mid to late 24th century. Show trials. In the DS9 episode Tribunal, one of your classic O'Brien must-suffer shows, we learn that, in the Cardassian Union, criminal suspects are guilty until proven innocent, and they're never proven innocent. Verdicts are decided before the trial even begins. The sentence is almost always death, or failing that, a lifetime of hard labor. Despite the merciless and predetermined nature of the Cardassian quote-unquote justice system, defendants are still forced to stand trial before sentence is formally pronounced. There's a judge and lawyers, but nothing is actually decided. Everything has already been decided before the trial even begins. The purpose of Cardassian trials, which are always televised, is to reinforce the public's trust in and submission to the authority of the government. Constant surveillance! Cardassia has a state intelligence agency, the Obsidian Order, that keeps tabs on everything everybody does. When he describes the order to Dr. Bashir in the episode The Wire, Odo puts it like this: "It is said that a Cardassian citizen cannot sit down to a meal without each dish being duly noted and recorded." They aren't merely saving this information for posterity either. Like the Nazi Gestapo, the Obsidian Order works to enforce loyalty to the state. Those suspected of being dissidents, or even just inconvenient to the state, have a tendency to disappear. I bet most of them don't even get show trials, much less actual trials. Grabbing people off the streets and shipping them off to God knows where without even the semblance of due process, that's some Nazi shit right there. I think we can all agree. The leader making self-aggrandizing speeches at everybody. At various points throughout the run of Deep Space Nine, we see this shot, an exterior of a Cardassian city, where people are watching the dear leader, Gul Dukat in this case, give a speech on a jumbo-sized TV. The content of the speeches are almost beside the point. It's the fact that the leader can broadcast himself to the entire country whenever he wants, and the people basically have no choice but to listen to him. The only reason shots like this don't read specifically as Nazi-esque is because this technology didn't exist while the Third Reich was in power. If Hitler had access to television broadcasting and stadium-sized screens, you'd better believe he would have been on there all the time, going off on one of his genocidal yet tedious rants. On a related note, the only reason Gul Dukat doesn't read more specifically and immediately as a Hitler analog is that he's too interesting. Gul Dukat is skin-crawlingly evil, but he's also a fascinating and multifaceted character, rife with inner conflict and possessed of an undeniable charisma and personal magnetism. Hitler was just... I don't get it. I mean, he was a monster. He was one of the most evil human beings who ever lived. But the guy had the personality of a head of cabbage. That's the biggest difference between the Cardassians and the real Nazis, and real dictators in general. On Star Trek, Cardassians are all so complex and dramatic. That's a big part of what makes them such great villains. No matter how morally repugnant they are, you can't help but want to watch them. But real-life fascists? From Mussolini and Hitler on up through present day, on a personal level, they're just not a very impressive bunch, are they? Like all cult leaders, to those of us outside the cult, their appeal is utterly inexplicable. Which is a good thing. I'm glad our actual fascists aren't as compelling as Gul Dukat. They do enough damage as they are. Can you imagine how fucked we would be if we ever got one who wasn't a dull, underwhelming schlub? Compulsory worship of the state. The big outdoor screens on Cardassia, I'll call them Ducat-O-Vision because I like my military dictatorships with a touch of whimsy. They remind me of a more advanced version of those propaganda posters and massive banners with images of the leader that you see throughout history in authoritarian regimes like the Third Reich, the Soviet Union, Communist China, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, North Korea, or the United States. Whether posters or banners or videos, the intent is the same. Bombard the public with images of the leader, of the state, to project dominance and omnipresence. We're powerful, we're in charge, we're everywhere. That subservience of the individual to the state isn't only expressed visually on Cardassia, it's a deeply ingrained cultural attitude. The Wire begins with a conversation between Dr. Bashir and Garak about a book called The Never-Ending Sacrifice, which Garak regards as the great Cardassian novel. Bashir describes the book as a long, dull story about the importance of dedicating yourself to a life of unquestioning duty to the state. So it's basically the opposite of Andor. except for being long and dull. Garrick insists that the qualities which Bashir finds boring about the book are the very qualities that make it great. To a Cardassian like Garrick, there is no greater calling than to live a life of service to the state. We meet enough Cardassians throughout the series to know that this feeling isn't universal, nor is it permanent. Many Cardassians, including Garrick, who start out as willing and eager servants of the regime, eventually turn against it. But obedience to the state is something that many, perhaps even most Cardassians seem to embrace. Small wonder that obedience is not merely encouraged, it's expected, demanded by the government. It's drilled into citizens from the moment they're born. Authoritarian? Yes. Totalitarian? I'd say so, yeah. But specifically, uniquely Nazi? No, not really. You can certainly read Nazi from what I've discussed about the Cardassians so far, but if that's all you know about them, you could just as easily read Soviet. What makes the Cardassians not just space totalitarians or space fascists, but space Nazis, to those who think of them as such, is their occupation of the planet Bajor, and their displacement, enslavement, and mass murdering of the Bajoran people. Obviously a metaphor for the Holocaust, right? Well, sure. Maybe. Cardassia's dark recent history with Bajor is introduced in the TNG episode Ensign, the second appearance of the Cardassians. In that episode, Cardassia's actions against Bajor are described as an annexation and mass-forced displacement of the Bajoran people from their homeworld. That's bad enough, but once Deep Space Nine starts, the details of Cardassia's crimes against Bajor are revised to make them even worse. The parallels between the occupation of Bajor and the Holocaust are brought into sharp focus by the first season DS9 episode, Duet. A Cardassian man comes aboard the space station and is arrested on suspicion of being a notorious Cardassian war criminal, essentially the equivalent of the commandant of a death camp. He denies it at first, then he admits that yes, he is the war criminal they've accused him of being. Then it turns out that war criminal has been dead for years, and this guy is an imposter who merely worked at the camp as a clerk. He's pretending to be the war criminal so that the Bajorans can put him on trial for the crimes Cardassia committed during the occupation, which he thinks will allow both planets to move on and also allow him to atone for his own participation in the occupation. If you're watching this video, you've probably seen Duet. It's an early high watermark for Deep Space Nine, one of the best episodes of that or any other Star Trek series. But the plot specifics aren't really important for this discussion. What's relevant here is how the occupation is characterized. And in Duet, it's obviously a Holocaust metaphor. Kira, who helped to liberate the camp where Maritza, the detained Cardassian, worked, describes the conditions of the camp in terms that resonate unmistakably with actual history. People beaten, sexually assaulted, starved, worked until they couldn't work anymore, and murdered. At one point, Kira calls the occupation genocide, and Maritza doesn't dispute it. While impersonating the former commandant of the camp, Maritza brags about the atrocities he committed, including ordering soldiers to go out and murder Bajorans. Then, late in the episode, with his true identity finally revealed, he cries and curses himself for a coward as he recalls covering his ears to block out the sounds of Bajorans screaming for mercy. Following Duet, the creators of Deep Space Nine told stories with additional details about the occupation that further strengthened the Holocaust parallels. During flashbacks to the space station while the occupation was ongoing, we see that, like Jewish people in Germany during the Third Reich, Bajorans are treated as second-class citizens and forced to live in designated sections of the station. We also see that they are subjected to the same arbitrary and brutal justice system that we've seen on Cardassia, only things progress far more quickly, from accusation to execution in a matter of hours. In the episode's Indiscretion and Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, we see that Cardassian officers, such as all-time #1 scumbag Gul Dukat, forced Bajoran women to work as comfort women, and would sometimes have prolonged relationships with them. In other words, sex trafficking. The occupation is briefly referenced in Star Trek Voyager, in the episode Nothing Human, where we meet a hologram of Masset, who, it turns out, is the Cardassian equivalent of Dr. Mengele. He carried out medical experiments on imprisoned Bajorans, killing thousands. The Cardassians also stole Bajoran wealth, looted and hoarded Bajoran art and historical artifacts, and forced many Bajorans to flee their homes, creating a significant Bajoran diaspora during and after the occupation. There are more examples, but I don't need this to be an exhaustive list in order to make the case for the occupation being a Holocaust metaphor. However, that's not the only case that can be made. There are many things about the Cardassian occupation of Bajor that don't fit with a Holocaust metaphor, that instead refer to a different, also brutal, historical injustice. From the first time it's mentioned in TNG's Ensign episode, we're told that one of the primary motivations for the occupation was to take Bajor's resources. This is reiterated in Duet and several other Deep Space Nine episodes. Much of the forced labor Bajorans are subjected to involves the mining and processing of ore from the planet. Additionally, in the Season 6 episode, Waltz, Gul Dukat mentions that the ultimate goal of the occupation was to fully colonize Bajor, to make it an extension of Cardassia, presumably populated by a bunch of Cardassians. All of that, occupying someone else's land, stealing their resources, enslaving their population, settling your own people there, is classic colonialism. The Nazis didn't really do that. And the Holocaust, specifically, was conducted against outgroups, many of whom were already living in Germany, as opposed to the Bajorans, presumably none of whom were in Cardassian territory before the Cardassians invaded Bajor. The Nazis were definitely expansionist, but the Third Reich wasn't colonial in the sense that we usually use that word. If the regime hadn't been toppled at the end of World War II, who knows how else? They might have tried to expand their empire, but as it happened, there were no overseas Nazi colonies, unless you count Argentina and the United States. The colonialist aspects of the occupation seem a much better match to European imperialism, which lasted for centuries and led to the colonization of much of the world. In North America, South America, Africa, and elsewhere, land was occupied and settled, imperial authority was imposed, natural resources and historical artifacts were stolen, and indigenous peoples were displaced, enslaved, forced to assimilate into the culture of the invaders, and often just straight up murdered. That kind of sounds exactly like the occupation. So does that mean the occupation isn't a metaphor for the Holocaust? And Cardassians aren't space Nazis, but space Europeans? Perhaps, but there's another possibility. The Cardassian occupation of Bajor has a lot in common with an ongoing real-world event that is also frequently referred to as an occupation: the occupation of the Palestinian territories by the State of Israel. Forced relocations, people being driven from their homes, some becoming refugees in other countries, some forced to live in camps, recurring military conflicts with a lopsided balance of power since the invaders are much stronger than those whose land has been invaded, violent resistance from the invaded people, resistance which is labeled terrorism by the invaders but generally regarded as just and necessary by the invaded, shockingly violent genocidal retaliation to the resistance from the invaders. All of those things are part of the occupation of Bajor. And all of those things have been part of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, Gaza and the West Bank, for decades. It's in the news now, and it was in the news 30 years ago when Deep Space Nine was in production. I don't think the resemblance is coincidental. Though I do have to say, if we're watching Deep Space Nine looking for a metaphor that represents the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Maquis situation seems like a much better fit. The Cardassians are given territory via treaty, territory that is already populated. The Cardassians try to force the residents of the territory out. They resist. Some resort to terrorism to fight back. So, okay, does that mean the Cardassians are actually space Israelis? Could be, though don't forget the Maquis are also obviously inspired in story and in the real world by the French resistance to the German occupation of France during World War II, which is another piece of evidence to add to the space Nazis pile. Is the answer to our topic question then that the Cardassians are space Nazis, but that they are also space Europeans and space Israelis? Can the Cardassians be space Nazis and space Israelis? How is that even possible? I don't know. How is it possible for the state of Israel to be created as a homeland for people who survived the Holocaust and then go on to commit its own genocide while still within living memory of the Holocaust? Doesn't seem like something that could happen, yet here we are. And this is real life, where the rules of what is and is not possible are a lot less forgiving than they are in fiction. The easiest, and in some ways the most honest answer to the question is that yes, the Cardassians are stand-ins for all of the above. Nazis, European colonialists, Israeli occupiers, Americans forcibly relocating, re-educating, and often just flat-out murdering the indigenous people of what is now the United States, which is a subcategory of European colonialism, but I wanted to mention it lest you think I'm overlooking it. The Cardassians can be any of those things, or something else entirely, depending on the story that's being told. In their decades-long occupation of Bajor, destruction of its culture and heritage, enslavement of its people, stripping of its resources, and eventual abandonment of it, once all that was no longer profitable, the Cardassians are playing out the same scenario as numerous other colonizing empires throughout human history. In their persecution, punishment, and displacement of both the Bajorans and the people living in the border colonies defended by the Maquis, the Cardassians are Star Trek's 24th century equivalent of the State of Israel, as it continues to inflict suffering upon the captive population of the Palestinian territories. And in their institutionalized dehumanization and mass murdering of the Bajoran people, as well as their totalitarian government, paranoid surveillance state, military aggression, and, let's not forget, tendency to give grandiose self-serving speeches, the Cardassians are absolutely the most loathsome bunch of space Nazis you'd ever want to topple from power in a horrific prolonged conflict. If the Cardassians have represented or could reasonably be read as representing all of these various groups of shitty people, why is it then that they are most often identified specifically with the Nazis? Because the Nazis are the shittiest? That's probably part of it. In our shared vernacular, the word Nazi has come to refer not only to the National Socialist German Workers' Party and subsequent groups inspired by the party or that share similar beliefs and goals, but also more generally to authoritarian and white nationalist movements and to people who are just overzealous, overbearing, dogmatic pricks who get called Nazis because they act like fucking Nazis. That generalization of the term is part of it too. When we see a totalitarian regime in a work of fiction, the first impulse of most of us is to associate it with the Nazis. The Nazis own totalitarianism. Congratulations, you Nazi fucks! But in addition to those points, I also think the Cardassians have a lot more in common with the Nazis than with the other groups they can be interpreted as representing. It's not just the fascism, militant expansionism, and genocide. It's also the fate that is shared by the Nazi regime and the Cardassian Union. The last couple of seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine revolve around the war between the Federation and the Dominion, which includes Cardassia. There's a lot more to the Dominion War storyline than a one-dimensional World War II allegory, but there is definitely a bunch of World War II stuff in there, and it serves to reinforce the Cardassians as Nazis concept. World War II was fought between the Allies, which consisted of the United Kingdom and the United States, plus the Soviet Union and China, who were not traditional allies of the US or the UK, but joined their side during the war, and the Axis powers, which consisted principally of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The Dominion War was fought between the alliance of the Federation and the Klingons, plus the Romulans, who were longtime enemies of the other two, but joined their side during the war, and the alliance of the Dominion, the Cardassians, and the Breen. So, some clear parallels between World War II and the Dominion War when it comes to the belligerents on either side, and ultimately, the result is the same. The Allies win, the Axis powers lose, and lose in devastating fashion. The arc of the rise and fall of the Cardassian Union is the same as that of the Nazis, rising to power during a time of economic depression and low public morale, establishing a draconian government domestically while forcefully expanding its territory through military conquest, starting a war on multiple fronts, and finally losing both the war and its control of the government. The fight is bloody and arduous. It takes years and costs millions of lives, but in the end, the Dominion is driven back to its home territory on the other side of the galaxy, while Cardassia stands in ruins. The dictatorship that ruled it for decades finally toppled. We win. I can go through an endless list of specific points of similarity between the Nazis and the Cardassians. Someone else who wants to argue that the Cardassians aren't stand-ins for the Nazis can go through their own equally endless list of ways that the two are different, or ways in which the Cardassians are a closer match to some group other than the Nazis. But to me, that literalist approach misses the point. The Cardassians aren't space Nazis because their story matches the history of the real Nazis beat for beat. They're space Nazis because they play the same role in their story that the Nazis played in history. The story and the message of that story are what really matter. Using the Cardassians, the creators of Deep Space Nine delivered the most important message of all about totalitarianism. It doesn't last. I'm sure the Nazi regime felt terribly permanent to those trapped under it or threatened by it, but it wasn't. The Third Reich persisted for 12 years. That's 12 too many, but as of next year, 2026, Star Trek will have existed for 60 years. History shows us that movements driven by hatred and fear will always be with us and can gain power and spread misery and destruction at any time if we fail to guard against them. History also shows us that things built on hatred and fear don't endure, but things built on truth and courage and compassion do. Multiple generations of artists working on Star Trek have been telling stories with metaphorical and sometimes literal Nazis as villains for 5 times longer than Nazi Germany existed. We win. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Noonts. Thanks, Noonts. Sean McNamara. Thanks, Sean. Ray Richardson. Thanks, Ray. Nathan P. Gillespie. Thanks, Nathan. Richard Lowry. Thanks, Richard. The Rogue. Thanks, The Rogue. Richard Stivelbond. Thanks, Richard. Shout Out Joke. Thanks, Shout Out Joke. Jared Bressler. Thanks, Jared. John Everett. Thanks, John. Fred Hamilton. Thanks, Fred. And now the new channel members. They are Brian Joseph Blake. Thanks, Brian. Paul Johnson. Thanks, Paul. Letitia. Thanks, Letitia. Scott Brown. Thanks, Scott. Last Alive. Thanks, Last Alive. Mike Roylance. Thanks, Mike. Aircan Master. Thanks, Aircan Master. Doug Zwick. Thanks, Doug. Barrett Struthers. Thanks, Barrett. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice-monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects. The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic. You know I love my Star Trek preachy and political. Well, we're gonna keep this going with a video looking at one of the most frequently addressed political subjects in the history of Star Trek: racism. Unfortunately, even after all this time, we still obviously have a lot to learn about racism. Fortunately, we have Star Trek to help teach us. And even more fortunately than that, even when Star Trek does a bad job teaching us about racism, we can still learn something from it. I'll talk about how in next month's video, how classic Trek actually missed the point about racism. That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.